She walked through the front door at 9:47 in the morning, and I knew before she said a word. My name is Mike. I'm 35 years old. I work in commercial insurance underwriting, and I had been sitting at the kitchen table since 7 a.m. with a cold cup of coffee and my phone face up on the table, watching the hours move. Amanda had told me she was staying at Jessica's. A girls' night. Nothing complicated. She'd be back by noon at the latest. I had said fine. I had meant it when I said it. That was Friday evening. This was Saturday morning. And the way she came through the door, the particular quality of her entry, the careful quietness of it, the way she set her bag down with an attention to sound that she never normally paid, told me something was wrong before the door had fully closed behind her. She was wearing the same clothes she'd left in. Dark jeans, a burgundy top I had always liked on her. Her hair, which she'd worn down the night before, was pulled back now in a way that looked hastily managed rather than chosen. There was mascara that had been wiped rather than removed, the faint shadow of it still visible beneath her left eye. She smelled of someone else's soap. I looked at her from the kitchen table, and she looked at me, and neither of us said anything for a moment that lasted longer than moments usually do. "Hey," she said finally. "Hey," I said. That exchange, 2 syllables each, the most ordinary greeting in the English language, contained more information than most conversations I had that week. I heard it in her voice, the specific pitch of a person bracing for something. I heard it in mine, the specific flatness of a person who has been sitting alone for several hours deciding how to be. Amanda and I had been married for 6 years. We had met at a mutual friend's birthday gathering when we were both 28. She was in marketing. I was 2 years into the underwriting position, and we had talked for most of the evening about things I can no longer recall specifically, but remember as feeling important at the time. We were good at conversation from the beginning, which is not always the case, and which had seemed, then, like a promising foundation. We bought the house in Crestwood 3 years into the marriage. We had built something real, or I had believed we had, which turned out not to be the same thing. She moved to the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water and drank half of it standing at the counter with her back to me, and I watched her shoulders and thought, she is deciding something. She was deciding how much to tell me, in what order, with what framing. I recognized the quality of the silence. It was the silence of someone constructing, not resting. "How was it?" I asked. She turned. "Good. Fun. We stayed up too late." She attempted a smile that almost worked. "Jessica sends her love." Something shifted in my chest that I couldn't immediately name. Not rage, not grief, something cooler and more precise. A specific alertness, the kind that comes when your body understands something slightly ahead of your mind. I nodded. I said I was glad she'd had a good time. I picked up my phone and looked at it without seeing anything on the screen. What I didn't tell her, what I held entirely to myself in that moment, was that Jessica had called me at 11:15 the previous night. Not to tell me anything, just to ask if Amanda had made it home okay, because she'd left Jessica's place around 9 and Jessica had been worried since she hadn't texted to confirm she'd arrived safely. Amanda had left Jessica's at 9 o'clock Friday evening. She had walked through our front door at 9:47 Saturday morning. 13 hours were unaccounted for, and my wife was standing at our kitchen counter telling me she had stayed up too late at her best friend's house, and I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee deciding, very deliberately, how this was going to go. To understand the weight of that Saturday morning, you need to understand what the previous year had felt like from the inside. Amanda and I had always had a functional marriage. I want to be precise about that word, functional, because it describes something real while also describing something insufficient. We were organized together. We managed the logistics of a shared life with competent coordination. The house, the finances, the social calendar, the small decisions that constitute most of a life, and that most couples navigate without drama. We didn't fight often. We communicated about practical things with reasonable efficiency. We were, by the visible metrics, a stable couple. What we had stopped being, somewhere in the 3rd or 4th year, was present with each other. Not dramatically absent, not hostile or cold or unhappy in any way that would have been obvious to an outside observer. Just slightly out of phase, like 2 clocks keeping nearly the same time. You don't notice the drift until you check them against each other and find the gap has accumulated. My work had become more demanding over the past 18 months. The firm had grown, I had taken on additional accounts, and the hours had extended without my fully registering the extension. I was home for dinner most nights, but I was not always there in the way that mattered, present in body, processing work in the remaining available space in my head. Amanda had mentioned it twice, the first time directly, the second time with the careful restraint of someone who had already said something once and didn't want to repeat it. I had heard her both times. I had made adjustments that were genuine but insufficient, and then the accounts had expanded further and the adjustments had quietly eroded. Looking back now, that pattern was the first of the things I had failed to take seriously. Not the hours themselves, the signal underneath them. Amanda telling me she felt like she was competing for my attention was not a complaint about scheduling. It was a statement about how she experienced our marriage, and I had responded to the surface rather than the substance. I had come home earlier for 2 weeks and considered the matter addressed. It wasn't addressed. It was deferred. She had started spending more time with Jessica the previous spring. This, in isolation, was entirely normal. They had been close for years, and their friendship operated independently of Amanda's marriage in the healthy way that good friendships do. But the frequency increased through summer in a way I noticed without examining. Weekday evenings that had previously been home evenings became Jessica evenings, with a gradual ease that suggested a pattern establishing itself rather than individual spontaneous plans. I was glad she had somewhere to go when I was buried in work. I told myself that. I believed it. The name Eric entered our house in July. Not dramatically. There was nothing dramatic about its arrival. Amanda mentioned him in passing over dinner, a new account manager at her firm, brought in to lead a restructured team. He had made a point in a department meeting that she'd found incisive. She mentioned it the way you mention a colleague who has said something worth noting. I registered the name and moved on. He came up again 2 weeks later. A project they were both attached to, a deadline that had required extra coordination. She described a working lunch. The whole team, she said, though the anecdote she shared featured only herself and Eric. I filed this without comment. What I didn't register at the time, and understand now, was that Amanda's tone when she mentioned Eric carried a quality her professional conversations didn't usually carry. A slight energy. The specific animation of someone talking about something they find more engaging than they're letting on. I heard it the way you hear a sound in another room. Present, unidentified, set aside. There was an evening in August when her phone buzzed while we were watching television. She was on my right, close enough that I could see the screen light up on the arm of the couch. She picked it up with a speed that was fractionally too quick for a casual notification, read whatever was there, and set it face down on the arm of the couch in a single fluid motion. Then she went back to watching the screen as though nothing had happened. I pretended to go back to watching too. But something had tightened in me, a small involuntary contraction, like a muscle responding to a stimulus before the conscious mind has weighed in. I didn't ask about the message. I told myself it was work, or Jessica, or something private that didn't require my involvement. I told myself this with the practiced ease of someone who has been telling himself comfortable things for long enough that the practice has become automatic. The honest version is simpler. I was afraid of what asking would open up. Not because I suspected anything specific, I hadn't named it to myself yet, but because the question I would have to ask felt, somehow, like the kind of question that changes things by being asked. So I didn't ask. I watched the television and held the small tightening in my chest and let the evening continue. That choice, to not ask, was the first of the specific failures I have since had to account for honestly. Not the only one, but the first. By September, Amanda had started taking longer to come to bed. I would wake at some point and reach to her side and find it empty, and from downstairs I could hear the low sound of her phone. Not music or a call, just the intermittent tapping of active texting. She always came up eventually. She always had an explanation when I asked. Jessica, she'd say, or a work thing, a message that needed a reply before morning. I accepted these explanations individually. Each one, on its own, was plausible. It was only later, holding them all together at once, that their cumulative shape became visible. The girls' night had been Amanda's idea, proposed on a Wednesday with a naturalness that I didn't question. She and Jessica did this occasionally, a Friday evening at Jessica's apartment, wine and conversation and the particular relief of a night outside the routine. I had no objection. I told her to have a good time. She kissed me goodbye at the door on Friday evening with her overnight bag over her shoulder, and I went back to a work file I had open on my laptop and didn't think about it again until Jessica called. The call came at 11:15. I was on the couch with the television on low, half reading a project summary, and Jessica's name on my screen registered as slightly unusual. She called me directly rarely, usually going through Amanda, but not alarming. I answered. Her voice had a particular quality. Not panicked, but precise in the way that someone's voice gets when they are being careful about what they say. She asked if Amanda had made it home okay. She said she'd left around 9 and hadn't texted to confirm she'd arrived, and Jessica had tried calling twice without answer, and she just wanted to make sure. I said Amanda wasn't home yet, that I'd assumed she was still at Jessica's. A silence of perhaps 3 seconds. Not long, but specific. Oh, Jessica said. She mentioned she might stop somewhere on the way. She probably just forgot to text. Never mind. I'm sure she's fine. She ended the call shortly after. I sat on the couch for a while. The television continued. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet with the particular quiet of a Friday night that has moved past its peak. And inside me, the low-level unease that had been accumulating since August was becoming something with a clearer shape. Not a certainty, not yet, but a cold, specific possibility that I could no longer comfortably dismiss. Amanda had left Jessica's at 9 o'clock. It was now past 11. She had not come home, had not called, had not texted. Jessica had covered for her in real time on the phone, which meant Jessica knew something she hadn't told me, which meant Amanda had arranged this cover in advance, which meant tonight was not an accident. I put the project summary away. I didn't sleep. She arrived home at 9:47 the next morning, and we had the exchange I already described, and I said nothing about Jessica's call. I said nothing because I needed to understand what I was actually dealing with before I gave Amanda the information that I had it. The moment she knew about the call, she would calibrate everything she said around it. I wanted to watch her without that calibration. I wanted to see what version of Friday night she offered me when she believed I had no reason to doubt it. What she offered me was the overnight story, stayed up too late, had too much wine to drive safely, slept at Jessica's. Delivered with a casualness that would have been entirely convincing if I hadn't known it was constructed. I told her it sounded like a good evening. I asked if she wanted breakfast. She said she was tired and was going to shower and sleep for a few hours. She went upstairs. I sat at the kitchen table and opened my laptop and went to Jessica's Instagram. Jessica posted frequently. She was one of those people for whom social media was a natural extension of social life rather than a performance of it. I scrolled back through Friday. There were 3 posts, one from the afternoon at a coffee shop, one from early evening that showed Jessica and 2 other women I didn't recognize at what appeared to be a wine bar, and one from later that evening, a group shot, for women including Jessica, at what looked like a house party rather than a quiet night in. Amanda was not in any of the photographs. I looked at the wine bar post. The timestamp said 8:43 p.m. The location tag was a bar called the Linden Room, which I looked up and found was downtown, about 20 minutes from our house. Amanda had told me she was at Jessica's for a quiet girls' night. Jessica had been at a wine bar at 8:43 and at a house party later in the evening. Amanda had left Jessica, wherever Jessica actually was, at 9 o'clock and had not come home until nearly 10 the next morning. I closed the laptop. Upstairs I could hear the shower running. The ordinary sound of a Saturday morning in our house. The rhythm of a routine we had established over 6 years. Amanda in the shower. Me at the table, the coffee maker cycling through its second pot. Everything sounding exactly as it should. That was the first time I understood, with a completeness I could no longer argue with, that the life I was hearing wasn't the life I was living. I had a name. Eric. I had a phone behavior that had been changing since July. I had a best friend who had covered for her, who had called me at 11:15 in a voice that was careful in a specific way, who had mentioned Amanda stopping somewhere without being asked where. The pieces were not yet assembled, but they were all on the table, and the shape they were forming was one I recognized. The question was what to do with that shape before I confronted Amanda directly. I decided to wait one more day, not from weakness, from the same instinct that had made me hold Jessica's call back that morning. I needed more than suspicion. I needed something I could hold. Amanda slept until early afternoon. When she came downstairs, she was showered and changed, and the version of herself she presented was more composed than the woman who had come through the door that morning. The hastily pulled back hair replaced by something considered, the mascara shadow cleaned away. She moved around the kitchen with the careful normalcy of someone performing a Saturday, and I watched her do it, and felt a particular cold clarity that had no emotion in it yet, just function. We had lunch. We talked about small things, a neighbor's renovation, a news story she had seen on her phone. She asked about my Friday evening. I said quiet, caught up on some work. She nodded. The conversation had the texture of two people maintaining a surface with mutual unspoken effort, and I wondered, watching her, whether she could feel the difference between this and our ordinary Saturdays, or whether she had been maintaining this surface for long enough that it had become indistinguishable from the real thing. After lunch, she went to the living room, and I went to my office under the pretext of finishing the work file from the night before. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop and thought carefully about what I was doing and why. I want to be honest about the moral weight of what I did next, because I have been honest about it with myself since. I went through Amanda's phone. Not by force. She had left it on the kitchen counter when she went to the living room, a habit from our early marriage that had recently become less consistent. It was there when I went back to the kitchen for water, unlocked because she had just used it. I picked it up. I had perhaps 90 seconds. I found the thread I was looking for inside of 40. Not because I knew the name. I found Eric's thread by searching the name, which appeared in the contacts under E, but because the thread itself was immediately identifiable by its compression and its rhythm, the specific brevity of two people who have learned to communicate in a register that doesn't require full sentences. I read enough to know what I was reading. I did not read everything. What I saw was sufficient: messages from Friday evening, a location sent between 9 and 9:30, a confirmation that had arrived and been acknowledged with a single-word reply that told me everything about where she had been and who she had been with. I put the phone back on the counter in the same position. I went back to my office. I sat at my desk for a long time without opening anything. The thing about having proof is that it doesn't feel the way you imagine it will. I had expected something: anger, or a kind of grim satisfaction, or the specific relief of uncertainty resolved. What I felt instead was a profound tiredness, the specific exhaustion of a person who has been carrying an unacknowledged weight for months and has just been shown exactly how heavy it was. The tiredness of a man who understood, sitting at his desk on a Saturday afternoon, that the marriage he had been living in for 6 years was not entirely the marriage he had believed it to be. I sat with that for a while. Then I called Jessica. She answered on the third ring, and I could hear immediately that she had been expecting the call, or dreading it, which is sometimes the same thing. "Mike," she said. "Jessica," I said, "I need you to tell me what actually happened Friday night." A pause, longer than the pause on the phone the previous evening. Then, "She's going to be really upset that I know," I said. "Tell me anyway." Jessica told me. Not everything. There were things she either didn't know or wasn't ready to say, but enough. Amanda had been at the Linden Room in the early evening, which matched the Instagram post I had found. She had told Jessica she was meeting someone afterward. She hadn't said who, had been deliberately vague, and had left the bar around 9. Jessica had known more than she had admitted on the Friday night call. She had been covering for Amanda, operating under the belief that what she didn't confirm, she hadn't truly lied about. "Did you know about Eric?" I asked. Another pause. Shorter. "She mentioned him." I didn't ask a lot of questions. I thought, she stopped. I thought it was probably nothing I needed to know more about. I thanked her. I ended the call. Jessica's position in all of this was something I would think about later with less clarity than I had in that moment. She had covered for Amanda, had called me under the guise of concern while knowing that concern was partly strategic, and had done it out of the particular loyalty that close friendships generate, the kind that sometimes operates at the expense of the people adjacent to the friendship. She had not lied maliciously. She had protected her friend in the way that people who don't fully think through the consequences of their protection sometimes do. The unintended consequence was that her Friday night call had unraveled everything. I went back to the living room. Amanda was on the couch, phone in her lap now, looking at something on the screen. She looked up when I came in. Something in my face, or my posture, or the specific quality of my stillness, registered immediately. I watched her expression shift from relaxed to alert in the space of a second. I sat in the chair across from her. I didn't speak immediately. I looked at her, and she looked at me, and the room was very quiet. "I need you to tell me about Friday night," I said. "The real version." She held my eyes for a moment. Then she looked at her phone, set it face down on the cushion beside her, and looked back at me. "How much do you know?" she asked. It was not the question I had expected. It was the question of someone recalibrating rather than denying, accepting that the denial had already failed and moving to assess the damage. I understood it immediately and felt, understanding it, a specific secondary grief I hadn't anticipated. The grief of recognizing that my wife's first instinct, in this moment, was tactical. "Enough," I said. "I want to hear it from you." She took a breath, and she began. She told me in pieces, the way people tell difficult truths when they haven't fully decided how much of the truth to tell. Not lies exactly. I don't think she lied to me in that conversation, which was a specific kind of credit I gave her and have since maintained. But calibrated disclosure, releasing what she understood I already had access to, holding back what she hoped I hadn't reached yet. Eric was a coworker. I had known that much. What I hadn't known was the duration. It had started in July, not as a physical affair initially, but as the kind of emotional closeness that exists in the space before one and is often more consequential. Messages that escalated. A working lunch that became a longer conversation. The specific gravity of someone who paid her a quality of attention that she had stopped receiving at home. I listened to this without interrupting. The skill of holding space for information that is actively damaging to receive is not a natural skill. It is learned, usually in professional contexts where the alternative to listening is losing something important. I had learned it at work. I deployed it now in the most personal context of my life. "How far did it go?" I asked when she paused. She looked at the cushion beside her, then at me. "Friday was the first time we were alone together. Nothing happened beyond kissing. I need you to know that." I held this. I thought about the messages I had seen on her phone, the location she had sent, the single-word reply confirming she had arrived. I thought about the 13 hours. "Kissing," I said. "Yes, more than once." Her voice was steady in the way that voices get steady when someone has decided to be honest and is paying the price of the decision in real time. "I know how that sounds." "I know it doesn't," she stopped. "I know it doesn't matter how it sounds. What were you doing for 13 hours? She met my eyes. We talked. For a long time. And then I couldn't come home. I wasn't ready. I drove around for a while, and then I sat in a parking lot, and then I drove home." She paused. "I know how that sounds too." I thought about her in a parking lot, in her car, in the dark, at some point in the early hours of Saturday morning, unable to come home. I thought about what the inability to come home meant, what it said about the state she was in and the decision she had not yet made. There was something in that image that was genuinely painful in a way that the affair itself hadn't quite been yet, because it was human in a way that betrayal sometimes isn't. She had not come home because she hadn't known what to do. That was not strategy. That was just a person lost. I didn't say any of that. I said, "Did you go to his place?" "No. I went to the Linden room. We met there. We left separately." "Does Jessica know what happened?" "She knew I was meeting him." "Not." She didn't ask for details. "I think she knew enough not to want them." I nodded. The room was quiet again. Outside, a car passed on the street. The afternoon light had moved across the living room floor in the hour we had been sitting there, the shadow of the window frame shifting incrementally, the day continuing its indifferent passage. "I want to know why," I said. Not angrily. Genuinely. Not to punish you with the answer. I want to actually understand. Amanda looked at her hands. She was quiet for long enough that I thought she might not answer. Then, "I felt invisible," she said. "I know that's not your fault entirely. I know I should have said it more directly. But I felt like I was living beside you rather than with you. And I was lonely in a way that I couldn't figure out how to say without it sounding like an accusation." She looked up. "Eric noticed me. That's the honest version. He noticed me. And I let myself enjoy being noticed. And I let it go further than it should have." There was a particular ache in that explanation that I recognized. Not because it absolved her. It didn't. But because I had already understood, sitting alone on Friday night, that the isolation she was describing was real. I had left her alone in our marriage in ways that were not intentional, but were also not accidental. I had chosen work over presence consistently enough that the choice had become a policy, and the policy had created a gap, and the gap had been filled by someone who paid attention. I understood that clearly, and I held it separately from what she had done with that understanding, because the two things were not the same. Her loneliness was real, and my contribution to it was real, and none of that created an obligation or a justification for what she had chosen. I told her that. She said she knew. She said it quietly, with the particular quality of someone who has rehearsed an argument for their own defense and arrived at the moment of delivery only to find they can't use it. Then she said, "I'm sorry, Mike. I don't expect that to be enough right now. I just need you to know that I mean it." I looked at my wife of 6 years. She was sitting across from me with her hands in her lap and mascara. Again, already, threatening at the edges, and she looked like someone who had arrived at a reckoning she had been postponing for months and was now fully inside it without the protection she had been maintaining. She looked, underneath the damage of the last 24 hours, like the person I had married. Both things were true simultaneously. That was the most complicated part. I said, "I don't know what I want to do with this yet." She nodded. She said she understood. I said, "Eric is done. Not reduced, not paused. Done. Tonight." She said yes. I said, "I'm going to need some time before I can decide anything. You're going to give me that time without pressure." She said yes again. I said, "And we're going to talk to someone. A professional. Not to save the marriage automatically. To figure out whether it can be saved and what that would actually require." She looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from her in a long time. Something unguarded and raw and entirely present. "Okay," she said. "Whatever you need." I stood up. I went to the kitchen. I made coffee, not because I wanted it, but because the activity was necessary, because standing at the counter with my hands occupied was preferable to sitting in the chair across from her for another moment without knowing what to do with my hands or my face or the enormous weight of everything that had just been said. I stood at the kitchen window and looked at the backyard. The maple had gone completely yellow. In another week, the leaves would be down. I thought about the parking lot she had described, Amanda alone in her car in the dark, unable to come home. I thought about what that meant and didn't mean. I thought about 6 years and the house in Crestwood and the life we had built with the competent coordination that I now understood was insufficient. I thought about the conversation I had not had in August when the phone buzzed and I chose not to ask. And then I thought, maybe we are not finished yet. Maybe what has been broken can be rebuilt into something more honest than what it was. Maybe the conversation we hadn't been having for 2 years was finally, painfully, beginning. I didn't know. I genuinely did not know. I poured the coffee. I brought a cup back to the living room and set it on the table in front of her without a word. She looked at it, and then at me, and something moved across her face that wasn't gratitude exactly. More like recognition. The recognition of a person who has been seen, in the middle of something they did not handle well, and has not been abandoned for it. Not yet. I sat back down in the chair. We sat together in the afternoon light, and neither of us spoke for a while, and the silence was different from the silence of that morning. It was still difficult, but it was honest in a way the previous silence had not been, and honesty, I had decided somewhere in the preceding 24 hours, was the minimum requirement for anything that came next. The counselor's name was Dr. Patricia Hollis, and she came recommended by a colleague of mine who had used her during a difficult period 2 years earlier and described her as someone who didn't tell you what you wanted to hear, which was precisely the qualification I was looking for. Her office was on the 3rd floor of a building downtown, a quiet room with 2 chairs and a couch, and the specific neutral aesthetic of a space designed to belong to no one in particular. We started seeing her 3 weeks after the confrontation. Twice a week initially, then once a week as the acute phase. That is the word Dr. Hollis used, acute, with the clinical precision of someone who has seen this many times and understands its stages, settled into something more manageable. The first 3 sessions were the hardest things I had done in a long time. Not because of Amanda, or not only because of Amanda, because of what the sessions required of me, which was an honesty about my own contribution that I had been resisting in the privacy of my own accounting. I had told myself, in the weeks after the confrontation, a version of events in which my role was clear. I was the wronged party. Amanda was the one who had acted badly. The arc of moral accounting was straightforward. Dr. Hollis did not allow that version to stand unexamined. She asked me, in the 2nd session, to describe our marriage in the year before the affair. Not the events of it, the texture of it, what it felt like from the inside. I sat with that question for longer than I should have needed to. And what came out, when I answered honestly, was an account of a marriage that had been technically functional and emotionally absent in ways I had not been willing to name. I had worked late. I had been present in body and somewhere else in attention. I had received Amanda's 2 direct statements about feeling invisible and addressed the surface of them without addressing the substance. I had chosen comfort over examination, the appearance of stability over the genuine article. I had, in the language the older man in a story I once heard described it, been maintaining the appearance of a marriage and telling myself that was the same thing. It was not the same thing. Understanding this did not make what Amanda had done forgivable. Forgiveness was a separate question that I was not yet ready to resolve. What it did was change the question I was asking. I had been asking, how do I survive this betrayal? Dr. Hollis helped me arrive at a different question. What kind of marriage did I actually want? And was I willing to do what that marriage required? The conditions I had set on the night of the confrontation held. Amanda ended contact with Eric. Completely, I verified through channels I am not entirely proud of using, though I used them. She changed her position at the firm within a month, a lateral move to a different team that removed the daily adjacency. She did not ask me to trust her on this. She offered the evidence without being asked, which was the correct instinct and the one that kept the process from collapsing in those early weeks. Jessica called me once during this period. She was apologetic in the specific way of someone who has had time to understand the full shape of what they had been part of. She said she should have told me sooner. I said I understood why she hadn't, because I did, and that what mattered now was what came next. We didn't become close after that, but the call mattered. It closed something that had been left open. The marriage did not return to what it had been. I want to be clear about that, because it would be dishonest to describe what emerged as a restoration. What emerged was something different, something that had been broken down to its structural elements and was being rebuilt with more attention to what those elements actually required. It was harder work than the original construction had been. It required conversations that we had been avoiding for years. It required me to be present in a way that my professional habits had trained me away from. It required Amanda to be honest about her needs in a directness that was new and uncomfortable and necessary. Some of those conversations were still happening months later. That is not a failure. That is what rebuilding actually looks like from the inside, as opposed to how it looks in accounts that need a cleaner ending. I took a week off work in November, the first real week I had taken in 3 years. Not a trip, just a week. We stayed in the house in Crestwood, walked in the park a few blocks away where the leaves had come down and the paths were quiet in the particular way of late autumn mornings, cooked together in the evenings in the unhurried way that you can when no one has a deadline. We talked. We were sometimes silent in the new way, the honest silence, not the performing one. We were careful with each other in a way that was different from the carefulness of the confrontation period. Less defensive, more deliberate. I am not going to tell you the marriage was saved, because I don't know that yet. What I can tell you is that it was changed by what happened, changed by what the response to what happened required, changed by the version of us that emerged from two people deciding to be honest with each other at a level that our previous marriage had not reached. Whether that is enough is a question that will answer itself over time. I have stopped trying to answer it in advance. Dr. Hollis said something in one of our later sessions that I have returned to many times. She said, "The goal isn't to get back to where you were. The goal is to understand why where you were wasn't working and to build something that does." That reframing shifted something in me. I had been measuring our progress against the marriage we'd had before October, which was measuring healing against the thing that had needed to be broken. The more honest measure was whether what we were building now had the properties the previous version had lacked: honesty, presence, the willingness to say the difficult thing before it became the thing that drove someone to a parking lot at midnight unable to come home. By those measures, we were doing the work. Whether the work would be enough, whether trust, once fractured at this depth, could be rebuilt into something that held the same weight, I couldn't say. Amanda couldn't say. Dr. Hollis, wisely, didn't pretend to say. What I knew was that I was no longer the person who sat at a kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee waiting for a door to open. I was the person who had learned, the hard way and at significant cost, that waiting is not the same as living, and that the conversations you avoid are never actually avoided. They are only deferred, and the deferral always collects interest. I knew what I had contributed to the failure. I knew what I required from the repair. I knew the difference between the comfort of performance and the difficulty of genuine presence, and I knew which one I was choosing now. The maple in the backyard lost the last of its leaves in late November. By December, the branches were bare against the gray sky, clean and structural, the shape of the tree visible for the first time in months, not hidden by what it had been carrying, just itself. I looked at it from the kitchen window one morning and thought, That's something. I made 2 cups of coffee. I brought them both to the table. Amanda came downstairs a few minutes later. She sat across from me. She wrapped her hands around her cup. She looked out at the yard. The tree looks different without the leaves, she said. More honest, I said. She looked at me. Something passed between us that didn't require more words than that. We drank our coffee. The morning continued. What this story ultimately describes is the specific failure mode of a marriage that confused functionality with health and the long, difficult process of understanding the difference between the two. Mike and Amanda's marriage did not collapse because of Eric. Eric was a symptom. The collapse, or near collapse, depending on where you locate the ending, had been building in the accumulated silence of a relationship where both people were managing the surface with competence while the interior drifted. Mike worked. Amanda felt invisible. Neither of them said, with sufficient directness, what was actually true, that they had stopped being present to each other in the ways that matter most, and that the gap their absence had created was real and widening and would eventually be filled by something. The accumulation effect in this story is worth examining closely because it operates on both sides simultaneously. Mike accumulated small, ignored signals. The phone turned face down, the messages at midnight, the name Eric appearing with increasing frequency and energy, and processed each one individually in a way that neutralized its weight. He was not, it should be said, simply naive. He was protecting something. Each time he chose the innocent explanation over the concerning one, he was making a calculation, and the calculation was that the cost of certainty was higher than the cost of comfortable doubt. That calculation was wrong, and it was wrong in a way that compounded. Every deferred confrontation made the next one harder, and the evidence that finally broke through was evidence that a different version of Mike might have reached months earlier. Amanda's accumulation operated differently, but with the same structure. She gathered evidence, in her own experience, that her needs were not being met, and instead of pressing the issue directly, she allowed the unmet need to find its own outlet. The Eric situation did not begin as a decision to betray. It began as a decision to feel something she wasn't feeling at home, and the specific danger of emotional affairs is precisely this. They develop their own momentum before the person inside them has explicitly committed to anything. By the time Amanda was meeting Eric at the Linden Room, she had been in a process of gradual escalation for months, each small step manageable, the cumulative distance from her marriage enormous. What the counseling process reveals is something that the confrontation alone could not have produced, the capacity for both people to examine their own contribution honestly. Mike's willingness to sit with Dr. Hollis's question, to describe the texture of the marriage, not just the events of the betrayal, was the moment the story shifted from damage management to genuine reconstruction. Betrayal, when it is responded to only with accountability for the person who acted badly, produces compliance rather than change. The structural problems that created the conditions for the betrayal remain. Mike understood this, not immediately, but through the process of being asked to look directly at his own role rather than only at Amanda's. That is, ultimately, what separates this story from a simpler account of wrongdoing and consequence. Both people had something to understand. Both people had to do the work of understanding it. Whether that work produces a marriage that is genuinely different or produces the appearance of one, is the question the story leaves open, and that openness is honest because it is the only truthful answer available. What stays with me about this story is the parking lot. Amanda alone in her car at some point in the early hours of Saturday morning, unable to come home. Not because she was hiding, because she didn't know what to do with what she had done. That detail is the most human thing in the story. Not the betrayal, not the confrontation, that moment of paralysis, of a person sitting with the consequences of their own choices and not yet knowing how to move. We tend to think of people who hurt us as certain, as deliberate, as people who knew exactly what they were doing and chose it anyway. But most of the time, that's not the whole truth. Most of the time, they're sitting in a parking lot at 2 in the morning, lost. That doesn't make it okay, but it makes it human. And you can't build anything real in a marriage or anywhere else if you can only see the version of the other person that's easy to judge. Mike chose to keep looking. That was the harder choice, and it was the right one.